to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Dave Debo.
And I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
After May 14th, how can we afford not to talk about race?
About education, about segregation, about humanity.
Since the dawn of this nation, racial violence has existed.
The way we have designed our society has a big hand in what occurred in that Tops market.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
Violence, more money into art.
We can investigate what policies.
If we're going to have some real healing, we've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
And this is Buffalo What's Next. Thank you very much for joining us. We're back with you live this morning here on WBFO, as a matter of fact. And coming up later on, Dave Debo is going to talk with Professor Ibram X. Kendi, the director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. That's coming up later on Buffalo What's Next. Right now, though, we're pleased to have with us Gary Earl Ross. A lot of titles for you. Professor Ross, retired professor from the University of Buffalo, teaching artist at Just Buffalo Literary Center, of course, playwright, novelist as well. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. So much to talk about. And I want to just get to a couple of things here. In your writing, I heard you did a little piece with, I think it was with the Birchfield Penny. And you talked about how you wanted to make Buffalo a character and wanted to bring Buffalo to the world through fiction.
Yes.
Expand on that just a little bit.
Well, I write mystery novels in addition to writing plays, but most of my fiction these days is in the mystery genre. And one of the things you'll know if you read a lot of classic mystery novels is that the city that a series takes place in frequently is a character. I mean, you read The Maltese Falcon, San Francisco is almost as much a character as Sam Spade. If you read the Spencer novels, Boston is very much a character. The Wachowski novels by Sarah Paretsky, Chicago is very much a character. And, certainly if you go back to Mickey Spillane's writing in the 40s and 50s, New York is a character in the Mike Hammer novels. So I wanted to have something like that for Buffalo, where Buffalo would be a character. And I could use locations, real restaurants, parks, and other things, and mix in fictitious locations as well. So that, I did have a confrontation in the first book, Nickel City Blues, that took place in the first couple chapters at the Anchor Bar. Didn't result in a shooting or anything. That happened at the Anchor Bar much later.
Right.
But I wanted Buffalo because I think Buffalo is a wonderful city. It has issues, it has problems, but it's still a wonderful place to live.
And I wanted to follow up on that then. So Buffalo as a character, since May 14th, what about Buffalo as a character? Have you seen something different about Buffalo since then?
What I have seen, I think, is that there is a lot of good nature. Despite its many problems, the human race, I think, is basically good. We're stubborn as all get out. I heard someone this morning on the radio saying it's nice here in Kentucky to see everybody helping everybody out in the flooding. And I'm thinking, if you're caught in a flood, you don't care the color of the hand that reaches out of the boat to help you off that roof, right?
All right.
Why not consider that every hand that's out there could be a potential helping hand, or at least a hand that offers a gesture of goodwill? Why not presume that before we presume the other stuff? Because, we shouldn't have a natural disaster forcing us to cooperate. But I see that in Buffalo. I saw a lot at the Tops Market, and I will say that section of Jefferson was across the street from the library, the North Jefferson Library, replaced by the Merriweather, but the original building is still there and used for something else. That's the library where I fell in love with books when I was a child. And that was my whole neighborhood, and it just broke my heart that something like this would happen there. So I think it brought out some of the positive feeling in Buffalo, but it also brought out an awareness that we have let some things go in our society and in Buffalo as well that we can't let go. They have to be addressed.
It's interesting you talk about that neighborhood and your fond feelings for it as well. And that is something that has also come out a lot of the conversations we've had here in the studio since we began the show, just that there are these strengths inside that neighborhood that are totally overlooked, it seems, by just the common knowledge of Western New York.
Well, let me tell you a little about the neighborhood when I was a kid. Because segregation was the written law of the land in the South and the unwritten law of the land in the North, I grew up in a segregated neighborhood. But what happened in my neighborhood was that we had everybody. Yeah, there were welfare recipients in my neighborhood, but there were also doctors and lawyers in my neighborhood, and teachers, and office workers, and plumbers, and electricians. And the neighborhood was segregated racially, but it was economically integrated. And I think economic integration is something we need to strive for nationwide. And I can talk about that. But when the racial difficulties of the 60s, the civil rights movement, some riots, and Buffalo had a couple comparatively small race riots, but they started to divide my old neighborhood because people who could afford to move to suburban homes now they had the law behind them. They couldn't be driven out. The people who could afford to move did. And one of the things that happened was that inner city neighborhoods began to have a bigger economic downturn when those who couldn't afford to move couldn't. And that was a divider that I think was crippling in the long run, because what we have is a circumstance where if you're in a neighborhood and you see people who are like you in all ways, you don't see other options. If you're in a neighborhood where you see a variety of types of people, and in terms of careers, we had people who, our doctor at one point basically lived around the corner. Dentist lived down the street. When we saw people like that, we had things to aspire to regardless of what we saw in our own homes. And I do believe that that is probably where the country needs to go, so that if we have a housing development, say, a certain percentage should be low-income housing. On the outside, people shouldn't necessarily know. But on the inside, the more elaborate home might have the stone countertop in the kitchen, and the cheaper home may have the Formica countertop in the kitchen. But they're both in the same neighborhood because, and then people get to see, what does he do? What does she do? What does their family do? And you get to learn about all kinds of other people. I think economic integration is the way to go. And the problem with being money-based is that we want to create housing that will produce a large profit. And that needs to be tempered, I think, where we have houses for lower income people, and a lot of lower income people are not lower income because they are slacking off. One thing the pandemic has taught us is that a lot of these people are working in service industries and are necessary. The people at the grocery store who get paid a minimum wage, I think their minimum wage should go up. I think they need more, but they're necessary. Right. And I think the pandemic exposed that, and we have work to do.
We're talking with Gary Earl Ross this morning on Buffalo What's Next. Thanks very much for joining us. We're back live with another program here this morning. Let's talk a little bit about language when it comes to trying to understand race, understand racial situations as they stand today. What are your thoughts there?
Language is a powerful weapon. And before I talk about visual language, let's talk about words. For example, the N-word used to not be the N-word. It used to be a full-throated proclamation. It could show up in Huckleberry Finn. It could show up on the lips of the person you're walking past if he decides that he doesn't like you. And that usually he.
That's
ashamed to say.
Yeah.
But it was such a common word. I mean, you know the Agatha Christie novel, And Then There Were None.
Right.
The original title in England was 10 Little N-Words.
Really?
Yes, because there was a rhyme. The American title, 10 Little Indians. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little, same sort of setup in England, but it wasn't a thing. And it's a wonderful book, a wonderful mystery. But the title was a toss-off. And Then There Were None is a much better title, and that's the one that it usually goes by now because publishers have gotten away from. They never did, in America, they wouldn't do 10 Little N-Words, which is why in the American edition it was 10 Little Indians.
Right.
And, but that language was a given without a problem because it was accepted. I mean, the N-word has such a long history where you look at sheet music. Run, Mr. N-word, run. You look at toys. The Jolly N-word Bank. I mean, there were toys, there were sheet music, newspaper stories, articles, things that just created the impression that people of color were inferior. My first novel, which is not a mystery, it's an historical novel, Blackbird Rising, takes place in Buffalo in 1901. And Buffalo had 1,691 or 81 blacks at that. The novel was published a long time ago. But out of the city population, the black population was fairly small. One of the newspapers had covered an appearance by a Southern professor who was speaking in Buffalo and talked about the Negro being a threat to the white worker, saying that, how did he put it? You can't compete with someone who will underlive a sewer rat to survive. Okay? Meaning, we're talking free labor, or close to free labor, or cheap labor. And, well, you can't do that. Well, the irony of that is that the language he used to inflame white workers against workers of color is the same language that slaveholders used to influence poor whites in the time of the Civil War to fight for the Confederacy, because most of them couldn't afford to own slaves. There were exceptions for slave owners, so they didn't have to answer the draft the same way non-slave owners did. And I'm thinking, the people who, like the shooter of tops, who said he believed in the great replacement theory, which is
right. It almost sounds like this professor from 1901.
Yes, and that's how old this thinking is. And if you stop and think about it, if the man down the road has a huge plantation with slaves and he doesn't pay them to do his work, and you don't have much of anything because people aren't paying you, if you thought about it for a minute, wait a minute, you could do some of the work they did. You could earn some money. But nope, the only thing you had going, well, at least you're a white man. That's the only thing going for you. And that system abused poor whites, not to the same degree it abused blacks, but it did abuse them and turned them against their neighbors. And I raised the question once in a conversation with someone. I said, suppose the South had won the Civil War, and then suddenly coal mining got to be a thing in Kentucky and Virginia and so forth. Said if they had slaves to work in their coal mines, do you think they would pay white miners to do it? Probably not. So the people were supporting a system that not only oppressed people of color, but oppressed poor whites as well, telling them at least they were white, they had something to cling to. And that's the whole notion here. And the idea of replacement theory, it's dumb, because this kid who came up and shot up Buffalo, And I have connections to a couple of the victims that I won't talk
Sorry to
about.
hear that.
One had been a former student of mine, and one I think was the brother of someone. And my daughter has a friend who had a relative there, and it's like, wait a minute. If you stop and think about it, you're 18, 19 years old. You're coming up to take out replacers. How did people in their 80s replace you? I mean, it's ridiculous thinking, but then ridiculous thinking is where we go with language. Most recently, a group of educators in Texas proposed changing the term slavery and slave with involuntary relocation.
Involuntary relocation.
Yes. Let's say that, because it's not as bad as slavery. And the thing is, and I hear this from Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott of Florida and Texas, respectively, they're concerned about, quote, wokeness. They don't want to have history taught that'll make white children feel bad. I reject that notion. I want them to feel bad. I want all kids to feel bad, not to feel guilty because they didn't do it. I want them to feel bad. I want them to feel empathy. And one of the things that's happening with our attempt to, quote, stop wokeness, which is ridiculously stupid, is that it creates the idea that there are certain things you can't talk about because of emotional content, and we miss the point. Stories are necessary. I've done a few lectures where I talk about the thing that separates people from animals is not the opposable thumb. It's not our capacity for talking. It's our capacity for story, because one of the things that happens with story is that we learn to empathize. If we take empathizing out of our equation, well, people should know facts and figures. They shouldn't have a political perspective. Well, you can learn empathy without dealing with politics. One of my favorite stories, and of course, I'm drawing a blank on the author's name. When I taught in the public schools, I taught a short story called The Soul of Caliban, which is now in the public domain. I think I'm going to make a recording of it. And that story dealt with a man who lived in the North Woods kind of thing. He had a dog. The dog was ugly and hideous from fights. And he married a woman, and they had a child. And she was always leery of the dog around the child, and so forth. And once they were both out of the cabin at the same time, without realizing the other was gone. And they got back, and they rushed in. The baby was alone. And they get into the first room of the cabin. They see the dog, Caliban, standing there, mangled with blood on his face. And the father, in a rage, takes his gun off the wall, shoots the dog. Then they go into the child's bedroom, and they find the baby behind the door. And by the baby's crib is a dead wolf. Your reaction is exactly the sort of thing we're supposed to have with empathy. I remember a student of mine, and her name was Kim. I won't give her last name. And she was in the 8th grade class. And when we did that story, and sometimes I liked to read aloud. Students had to read assignments, and sometimes I would read to them. She burst into tears. That's important. And I remember her name because when my son was in Iraq, I had a piece appear in the news about being the father of a soldier. And she wrote to me. She had a son who was in the Marines and in Iraq at the same time. So I remember her from that. But that moment of empathy, of fellow feeling for another living thing, is one of the reasons we have stories. And if we take empathy out of the mix, I mean, and I don't want to get political, but there's an awful lot about current conservatism that lacks empathy. And that gets to be a problem when we're trying to build a society where people respect each other and interact with each other. You've got to have some feeling about other people. Just as you don't care when the hand that comes out of the boat and pulls you out of the flood, you don't care what color that hand is. You don't do that because you're scared, number one. And number two, the person reaching for you doesn't care what color you are either, because that person is feeling the empathy of the situation. Here is a fellow living thing that is suffering or in trouble, and I'm in a position to help, so I must. You do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
We're talking with, Professor Gary Earl Ross with us right now on Buffalo What's Next. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more. This is Buffalo What's Next on WBFO.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter at WBFO or email us at news@wbfo.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is
My name is Jay Moran. We're with Gary Earl Ross this morning for another 10 minutes or so here on Buffalo What's Next. Interested about the origins of your writing from this standpoint. Was it a desire just to write, or did you feel like you had something to say?
Long story short, my mother was a great reader and took her children to the library somewhat regularly. One Saturday when I was 10, it was a Saturday in April, and it was a rainy Saturday, I do recall that. We went to the library, picked up books, and got home. One of the new books that had just come out then was Ray Bradbury's R's for Rocket, a short story collection. I spent the next couple days reading that book, and I decided I wanted to tell stories. Now, I don't know that I had anything to say at 10, but I loved Bradbury's language, and I really got into reading. I mean, I had been a reader from the time I was 3, but that was the trigger that put me into avid, passionate reading. And so when I decided to write, I thought about, part of it was I wanted to tell cool stories.
Okay.
I mean, because, and I was old enough at that point to sit up and watch Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and they had wonderfully clever stories, many of which I've taught and used the videos in classes over the years. But I wanted to tell cool stories, and I started reading books on how to write, and I started trying to sell my stories at 13. I sold my first story at 18.
Wow.
And didn't sell my second story till I was 27 and dealt with graduate school, but that's a whole other thing.
We all have our lean periods.
Yes. But I've sold consistently since then, and I slowly developed a sense of having things to say because there were things.
So did that come out of the writing process?
Yes.
Then because I think sometimes what's lost is an important message, and it is the idea that we read something, it's there, it comes to us, but there is a process. The writing process is a thinking process as well.
It's very much that. And at 10, I couldn't think my way out of a paper bag. But later in high school, I was blessed at Bennett to have wonderful English teachers, and including Elizabeth Nuschel, who taught AP English, and I was in her AP English class. She once came to a talk. She'd long before she passed away, and she was quite old at that point. And she came to a talk I was giving on classic murder cases one day, a public talk. And I was thrilled to see her. She said, "I just wanted to see how you were." But I learned to think, to give meaning to the stories that I wanted to create. And the more I read, the more I thought. And for most of my life, from my teen years on, I put away probably 100 books a year, about 2 books a week. And then that slowed down in retirement. I'm probably at 70 books a year at this point because I'm writing more.
I was going to ask that then. How much writing do you do? Daily? You write daily?
I try to write every day. I usually work about 3 or 4 hours a day at this point. As I'm older, I've slowed down some. I've had some health issues, but I try to put in about 3 or 4 hours a day. Now, right now, I'm not writing because my 3 or 4 hours are going into the next audiobook. The 4th Gideon Rhymes novel, Nickel City Naked Lady, came out in May. And my publisher, after we talked on the phone, she said, "I'd like to do audiobooks." And I said, "Well, I used to do radio commentary for WBFO, and and so forth. She said, well, you have a good voice. You can.
Yes, you do.
So I do audiobooks. So that's taking my time right now. But I have only 8 chapters left to do in that book. And then I'm going to move on to my next writing project.
Okay. Hey, and speaking of which, we talked about this before we went on the air, and I don't want to forget this, but the Nickel City series.
Mm-hmm.
You're up to 4 of them, and Gideon Rhymes is the hero of the books. Nickel City Storm Warning, very prophetic. Is that the word we want to use? Came out in 2021.
Yes. The 3rd book in the series, and originally I had planned to make it the 4th book in the series, but politics, after the 2nd book, Nickel City Crossfire, came out, the political situation was getting so dire, I thought I should move it up. And Nickel City Storm Warning is about a white supremacist attack at a diversity convention in Buffalo. And it was completed in 2019. The book was completed. And it didn't come out until 2021. I changed publishers along the way. That's a whole other story. But my new publisher needed rights to the first 2 books, so I got that. I had to get those back. But so Storm Warning came out in 2021. I didn't want to wait because I thought the way things are going, particularly after the Unite the Right rally that was at Chancellorsville that saw this woman run over by a car and so forth. I thought we're going to have some other incident, and let's address some of that now. So I started doing the research on the roots and causes of white supremacy, and I put together Storm Warning. And there are parts of Storm Warning that a friend of mine, I shared some parts with him. He posted a couple pieces on Facebook, and people were horrified and reacting. And I had to get on Facebook and explain, those are not my words. They are words derived from or inspired by a website, a white supremacy website, or the N-word joke page, or some other things.
And you spent considerable time on these pages.
Yeah, if you ever want to feel like you want to justify your shower, go to a white supremacist website, read for 20 minutes, and the shower will be a relief. It's just it's horrifying. But and I thought, I don't want to wait too long because this book needs to come out, and it did in 2021. The reviews were pretty good and so forth. And then, lo and behold, there's a white supremacist attack in Buffalo, and I felt really eerie about that. It wasn't the way I had predicted it. There wasn't a particular group. This white supremacist group was called Liberty Storm. They were the chief villains of that book, and my detective was part of a team that was trying to protect the keynote speaker at the conference, which is how he got involved. Gideon Rhymes as a character is based in part on my son David, who did 3 combat tours in Iraq and then went on to be a police officer. And he's now retired from the police, and he works as deputy director of security for a major defense contractor. I won't embarrass him by saying which one. And but he's partly the inspiration for that because Gideon Rhymes is an Iraq War vet. And I was trying to think of, and he's got a little of David in him, he's got a little of me in him. And I was trying to think of a name for this character I wanted to create. And every name I came up with, I Googled it, and somebody had that name. When I finally came up with the name Gideon Rhymes, I Googled it, nobody had that name. I thought, that's it. That's my guy. So we're going to go with that. So he becomes an active part of the Nickel City. The narration is first person for these novels, and he goes different places in Buffalo and has a strong sense of justice. And I love the PI genre for that kind of thing. You can create a character who isn't flawless. He's not an anti-hero in the sense that he does awful things, but he's an observer. He observes an awful lot, and his observations count. But those novels aren't as political as they could be. I mean, my play Matter of Intent deals with the failure of the insanity defense for defendants of color. And there are a couple twists in that. My play, The Mark of Cain, is based on a 1925 case where a black doctor in Detroit bought a home in a white neighborhood, and the house was attacked the second night the family was in. Somebody inside fired a gun, somebody outside died, and everybody in the house was charged with first-degree murder, and Clarence Darrow became their lawyer. I play The Trial of Trayvon Martin, flips the script and kills George Zimmerman and puts Trayvon Martin on trial.
How did he fare? As good as George Zimmerman?
No. Somebody said to me, but there's no real surprise that the criminal justice system would treat him differently. I said, right, that's no surprise. And the question for you to ask is, why do you automatically assume that the criminal justice system will treat him differently? Because if you make that assumption, it comes from something. We imprint so many expectations and images and other things based on language, imagery and film. And I'll say one thing about imagery and film. Sometimes it's overt. I don't know nothing about birthing no babies. You look at Gone with the Wind. Or Mantan Moreland in one of the Charlie Chan movies. He's the chauffeur, Birmingham Brown. Feets don't fail me now. Or even in the animated world. Well, I'll be done seeing about everything if I see an elephant fly. And all those images they sit in the backs of our brains for one thing or another. And so my plays are more often issue-oriented than my books, my novels. But the novels have microaggressions sometimes. For example, in Nickel City Blues, the first book, a cop refers to Gideon Rhymes as Shaft at one point. And he thinks, really? Because that's the thing, you see it in a lot, and you've seen it in cop shows or movies or what have you. Hey, Slick, my name is not Slick. Because I'm black doesn't mean you get to call me Slick and think that it means something. So.
Gary Earl Ross, our time is coming to an end here. I just want to make sure, though, when it comes to getting a hold of your books, where can folks go?
It's my new publisher. It spends a lot of time marketing online. Bookstores can get them; it's harder, but it's easier to go to the publisher's website, SEG Publishing, or to hit Amazon, and or just everything I have is on Amazon. If you look at Amazon and you want to find another way to get it, you can do that.
Very good. Well, it's I think we're going to give we had a lot of readers in this audience. I think they're going to be. Let's see if they can get to your pace of 100 books a year. Gary Earl Ross, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is Buffalo What's Next.
Watch the WNED PBS original production, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America.
What his parks are all about is finding immensely practical solutions to the problem of building a dream in the middle of a city.
Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America, now streaming on YouTube and the PBS video app.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter @WBFO or email us at news@WBFO.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
This is Dave Debo. Thanks for being with us. Professor Ibram X. Kendi is here. He's a nationally known name in the field of studying how to combat racism. He's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist and a new book, How to Raise an Anti-Racist. He's a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. He's the director and founder of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research. And quite frankly, really, he is a leader in this entire field, an expert on the concept of anti-racism. And we'll get into what that is in just a moment. Dr. Kendi, thanks for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with some terms. I know a lot of your work has focused on this idea. In fact, you're probably the person that sort of came up with the concept, anti-racism. That's different from just not carrying torches or thinking I'm colorblind. Talk about the actual concept of anti-racism, if you can.
Well, I think, scholars and activists and advocates and intellectuals have been using the term anti-racism or even anti-racist for decades. And what we've meant by that has been to create a structure of policies and practices that are leading to equity between racial groups. And they're substantiated by ideas of racial equality. And so differing racial groups have the same, and people think they should have the same because people view them as, as equals, which of course is in contrast to many of our communities that are experiencing racism, which is a series of policies and practices that are leading to racial inequity between racial groups. And people are substantiating those inequities by ideas of racial hierarchy. In other words, certain groups have less because they are less.
Because of things like implicit bias, though, I'm thinking that it's not enough for me as a white person to say, oh, I'm not racist. Oh, I have black friends. The concept of anti-racism, to my mind, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, really takes on a certain level of activity. The expression I've seen in other interviews was passivity equals complicity. You're looking for people to strive not to be racist and then take it the next step to the policy level?
Well, indeed, because when you have a status quo of inequality, when you have a status quo of widespread racial disparities, and you do nothing, what happens to that status quo? It persists. Those who are instituting the policies to maintain that status quo, they want the rest of us to do nothing. People want us to do nothing as they make it harder for certain people to vote. And just as people wanted people in Buffalo and Boston, where I lived, to do nothing during the era of slavery, because that would ensure its permanence. So that's why I'm asking for people to be actively anti-racist, because that's the only way to undo racism.
Does that actively mean not just battling racist policies, but just confronting it on the level of a microaggression? I'm getting my oil changed. I roll my window down. The mechanic starts talking to me while they're doing the work, and he says something about the shootings that happened here in Buffalo. And he uses a phrase like, oh, those people just don't. If we're talking about anti-racism, am I obligated to stop him right there and give him a correction?
I don't think anyone necessarily is obligated. However, in that moment, I think if you recognize that what someone said is wrong, I think it's a duty, it's a moral duty for us to let that person know, particularly because how would that person know that that what they're saying is wrong? Or a person will think twice, hopefully, the next time they offend or degrade a particular racial group. So certainly these interpersonal things that are happening in our lives, we should be speaking up. But more important to that, certainly is figuring out ways for us to change the policies that are really impacting whole communities.
And how do we do that? It sounds like, and forgive me, I don't want to oversimplify, but it sounds as if you're talking in a lot of ways about an attitudinal shift. And I think dismantling some of the systemic stuff, the segregation on Buffalo's East Side, the disinvestment on Buffalo's East Side, those things, to my mind, take more than just an attitudinal shift. Because of the word systemic embedded right in it, that would require some sort of change in the system.
It would. At the same time, I don't want us to think it's just impossible to do, because the disinvestment, the segregation, the police violence, these are the result of policy choices, or the refusal to make certain policy choices, or the refusal to institute protective policies. And so really, just as if you have an individual who harms another individual, we would investigate to figure out, okay, who harmed that individual, when and why. So too, when it comes to larger conditions in a community, we can investigate what policies and practices led to these conditions? Who has the power to change those policies? How can we go about then influencing that person or basically replacing that person to get those policies changed?
How does that intersect with the politics of a city like Buffalo, where we have had an African-American mayor for 16 years, where policies may not be overtly racist and where most people would say, oh, I am not a racist? Granted the shooting happened, and we can talk about that. But if we're talking policy change in a city that is already governed by an African-American mayor and a city council that is mostly African-American, can we say that they just haven't adopted enough change to the systemic things?
Well, I don't think we should assume that because you have a Black person in a position of power, that Black person is going to support anti-racist policies. Black people are a highly diverse group of people, just as white people and Latinx people and Asian people are, and there are many different perspectives on what the problem is and what the solution is. And so the question for any policymaker, no matter their race, is what is the effect of the policies that they're supporting? Are they having an equitable or an inequitable, effect? And I think that's why I'm supportive of getting policymakers, no matter their racial background, that are committed to anti-racist policies that are going to improve Black communities and Latinx communities and white communities and really all our communities in positions of power.
I apologize for any stereotype I might have made there earlier. I understand your point. I'm also thinking that the kind of systemic change you're talking about would require a different workflow. I think of Congress and how a couple years ago they passed bills that said if you're spending more money, you have to tack on the end of the bill an analysis of where that money is going to come from. Are you suggesting that we need to have a way of analyzing whether every policy is in fact anti-racist? So
I actually think that's something we consider. I mean, I think your premise of the question, which is that when we typically institute a new policy, there is, even oftentimes at the local level, an assessment of the economic impact of that policy. Why can't we have a similar assessment about the racial impact of that policy? Is it inequitable? Is it going to lead to more equity, in the community? I mean, and because just as there are scholars and experts in Buffalo who can make an economic assessment about a new policy, so too are there scholars and intellectuals and activists and people in the community that can make an assessment as to whether a policy is going to hurt them or harm them. But the problem, though, is when it comes to race and racism, those of us who have expertise based on our lived experience or based on training and coming to understand racism through formal training, we are dismissed. Our expertise is dismissed. And apparently, it's just imagined that they're just different people with different opinions, and when in fact there is a such thing as expertise, and we should certainly use it when it comes to this specific topic, because how are we ever going to eliminate racism if we're ignoring the experts on it?
And by experts, you mean those who have had lived experience, no?
Well, that's part of it. You've had certainly people who have had lived experiences, and they can tell you, based on their lived experience, what a particular policy or set of policies are going to have done to their communities or to them, just as you have people who have studied racism at a structural level over the course of their career, in the academy or even in the community, who also has that form of expertise.
How much of all of this, and I know much of your writing, including your most recent book, delves into the field of education. How much of all of this kind of reform that you're talking about needs to be more than just the political sphere, but also at the very grassroots level in how we educate our children?
I mean, I just recently came out with a book called How to Raise an Anti-Racist, which most of the book was talking about the ways in which we need an educational system that systematically teaches children that the racial groups are equals as opposed to our current educational system, which too often does not talk about racism as being the cause of racial disparities that our young people can see. So they're trying to figure out why, Black people are disproportionately poor in their city, why Black people are more likely to be incarcerated or killed by the police. And no one is willing to talk to them about racism in schools oftentimes. And so the only other explanation is there must be something wrong with Black people, or, white people have more because they are more. And then too often in our schools, literally white people are more in the curriculum. So it's sort of reinforcing for kids of all racial backgrounds this idea that white people are more by us not talking about racism and by us not ensuring that we have an extremely diverse, multicultural educational set of offerings.
Does that mean embracing Black history more than just in 1 month a year?
Yes. That means in teaching Black history. That means, teaching Black women's history. That means teaching the history of poor people. That means teaching Asian American and Latinx American and Native American history. That means teaching the history of all the different groups who make up this country.
Is it more than that? Darth Vader is evil. He's the black. Luke Skywalker is white. He's the white. The cowboy in the white hat, the cowboy in the black hat. Is there a cultural component? Would just adding Black history and more relevant curriculum be enough? Doesn't there need to be kind of a cultural shift as well?
Well, the way you teach Black history matters, because if you teach a Black history where Black people have historically been these people who were victimized, and at each point in history they were saved by white people, you're actually teaching racist ideas, even though you're teaching Black history. And you're not actually teaching an accurate history, because you're not teaching this long storied history of Black people, again, from Buffalo to Boston, engaging in resistance, to racism. So certainly how you teach it. And then we just have to acknowledge that there are multiple cultures in this society. And we have to teach those different cultures and teach respect for those different cultures so that our kids can not only be racially literate, but they can be culturally literate. And through having both forms of literacy, they can be able to interact and operate within a multiracial, multicultural society and world.
Ibram Kendi is with us. He's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. More recently, How to Raise an Anti-Racist. He is the founder and the director of the Center for Anti-Racist Research at Boston University. Tell me a little bit more about why this has not happened sooner. I think of George Floyd, and we have had several guests on this program previously that said that was a concrete example. That was something that was in everybody's living room on their TV. You couldn't turn away and not see Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck. After such a visceral moment like that, why do we have a shooting like we did here at the Tops in Buffalo? Is society not ready for the kind of change, even though they see the violence that brings it right into their house?
So I think we can narrate precisely what happened in the summer of 2020, which then can explain how we can go from the murder of George Floyd just to the recent tragedy and mass murder, in Buffalo. And that is within a week or two of George Floyd's murder, you had people demonstrating against racism and police violence. And in response or reaction to their demonstrations, you had people from the President of the United States on down at the time saying the problem was not the police violence that is so systemic. The problem isn't white supremacy. The problem isn't racism. The problem are those demonstrators. And as the summer went on and more demonstrations took hold all over the country, we, as people, primarily saw the demonstrations that turned violent, which then allowed the president and others to say, that's the actual problem. even though by the end of the summer, one study found that I think 96% of demonstrations were peaceful. But so people started thinking, oh, the problem are those, quote, violent demonstrators. The problem is anti-racism. And the problem that then connected to this old idea that the problem is diversity, the problem is multiculturalism, the problem is people of color. And then that idea is a white supremacist talking point. That then causes people to think that that white people are under attack and that white people are being replaced. And so that, of course, white replacement theory was one of the theories lurking in the mind of the person who came to Buffalo. And it was, and so we're living in this moment in which we have so many powerful people with megaphones saying the problem are those people who are challenging racism, or even those people of color, which then inflames white supremacist terror.
And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's Ted Cruz holding your book up on the floor of the Senate and denouncing it and the things in it. Am I right?
Exactly. So not the problem is that you have children as young as 3 years old thinking that dark people are ugly. No, that's not the problem. The problem are those of us who are writing books for young people so they know that dark and light are both beautiful. And then they say that we're harming children. So anybody who cares about white children or black children are then going to go after the people who they're being told are harming them. That then leads again to this white supremacist violence.
In your book, you talk a lot about the two souls of the United States, the idea that there is a soul of justice and a soul of injustice. Is that these two forces against each other right there in the description you had?
Yes, and I think this is the historic clash, in this country. We have certainly had people who were champions of slavery, champions of poverty, champions of patriarchy and homophobia and all sorts of, violence. And then you've had other people who have engaged in resistance against slavery and different forms of bigotry and poverty and structural violence and white supremacist, terror. And we've been fighting and battling since the origins of this country.
Is it a winnable battle for either side?
I think so. And I think there have been certain moments in American history where we thought that the side of justice was, at the point in which it could then reconstruct this country based around ideas of equality and justice and freedom. And certainly that moment was after the Civil War. That moment was during the Civil Rights Movement. But unfortunately, in both cases, you've had this withering backlash, from the forces of injustice.
And the phrase liberty and justice for all has problems for you. Talk a little bit about liberty and how you define it.
Well, I actually define freedom and liberty as coming after power. So I think in order to truly be free, you have to have the power to choose, to make choices. And so that power then allows you to choose your own life course, as opposed to a situation in which other people are choosing your life course for you. And I think certainly, women and Black people and other groups of people have been fighting for the ability to be free through gaining power, again, since the origins of this country.
What advice would you have to Buffalo, both at large and specifically the community where this shooting occurred?
My suspicion is that there are many people in the community of Buffalo who are experts on the history and the presence of racist policies and practices. And it's likely that those people have been calling attention to those policies and practices for years. And when is the community writ large going to start listening to them and making moves on those policies and practices to create a more equitable and just Buffalo.
Back in 1990, there was such a study conducted by the University of Buffalo looking at all the obstacles in terms of segregation and medium income and poverty and unemployment. And they just recently, in the past 2 years, updated it. And the title of the update report was The Harder We Run. The idea that even though it had been some 35 years later, progress had not been achieved. Is Buffalo unique?
I think that in certain ways, Buffalo is unique in the sense that the levels of segregation, the lack of resources for the Black community, in particular, particularly the impoverished Black community, those levels are, from my understanding, higher than they are in other cities across this country. So there is that uniqueness, but then there's obviously similarities, that the disparities and inequities and injustices that Buffalo is facing, other cities of comparable size, in metro regions are facing too.
Cancer nurses always say that they enjoy their job despite the struggles. Do you have optimism? Are you a hopeful guy?
I'm hopeful largely because I don't believe that I can put in the effort and the energy that it takes to build, a nation that's going to be better for almost every single one of us. If I didn't believe that anti-racist society, was possible. If I didn't believe we could create a society where we're distributing resources based on need, as opposed to based on who already has the most. If I didn't believe we couldn't create a society where we truly have equal opportunity, then it would be hard for me to put in the work, to make that happen. And so I'm hopeful that society is one that we can create.
How long have you been involved in this field, and over that time, has you seen enough progress to engender that sort of hope?
I feel like I've been in this field really ever since I decided to major in African American studies as a junior, in college, which was about 20 years ago. And I though am trying not to gain or lose hope based on what I'm seeing or not seeing. I'm trying to ensure my hope remains constant and remains philosophical, that we just can't bring about change if we don't believe it's possible.
So I don't want to be the one putting words in your mouth. It sounds as if you are saying you still have hope despite a lack of progress.
Yes, and the other reason is because my enslaved ancestors still had hope that slavery would one day no longer exist in this country. And so if they could maintain hope despite the brutality of slavery, despite it lasting for 250 years or so in this country, then I feel like we can maintain hope today and continue to resist racism and try to create a new nation just as my ancestors did.
Dr. Kendi, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
That's Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, the founder and director of Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research, and known nationally, I think, for the best-selling book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. A reminder, you can listen to this on the podcast or on demand at WBFO.org if you want to hear this guest again, or even Jay Moran's earlier guest, Gary Earl Ross. In the meantime, we will continue this discussion tomorrow on WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown. I'm Dave Debo. Thanks for listening.